Picture this scene if you can. The morning mist clings to the battlefield as Roman legions advance in perfect formation. The clash of shields echoes across the valley, gladii gleaming in the dawn light. But something else moves through the chaos, something that strikes terror into the hearts of seasoned warriors. Low growls rumble beneath the din of combat. Massive shapes dart between the ranks, their eyes burning with trained fury. These are not ordinary dogs. These are Rome's most ruthless and efficient killers, bred for one purpose alone: to destroy without hesitation, without mercy, without question. The image of Roman military might usually conjures thoughts of disciplined legionaries, towering siege engines, and masterful tactics. But hidden in the shadows of history lies one of Rome's most devastating and terrifying weapons. A weapon that could turn the tide of battle in mere minutes. A weapon that enemies feared more than the sharpest gladius or the heaviest catapult. Are you ready to discover the brutal truth about Rome's war dogs? The specially trained beasts that were engineered to kill on command and programmed to show no mercy to anyone marked as an enemy. What you're about to learn will shatter everything you thought you knew about Roman warfare. We'll uncover the shocking breeding programs that created these four-legged killing machines, the brutal training methods that turned loyal companions into merciless assassins, the battlefield tactics that use these dogs not just as weapons, but as instruments of psychological terror. And most disturbing of all, we'll reveal the specific techniques these animals were taught to take down heavily armored opponents with surgical precision. This isn't just another story about ancient military history. This is an investigation into one of Rome's darkest secrets, a weapon so effective and so feared that enemies would flee at the mere sound of their approach. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why these war dogs were considered more valuable than gold, more deadly than any human soldier, and more loyal than any political alliance Rome ever forged. The origins of Roman war dogs stretch back to the very foundations of the empire itself, but their story begins in the mist-shrouded mountains of ancient Italy. Long before Rome became the master of the Mediterranean, the early Romans encountered tribes that fought alongside massive, fierce canines. These weren't pets or hunting companions. They were weapons of war, bred and trained by Celtic and Germanic peoples, who understood that the right dog could be worth a dozen warriors. The Romans, ever pragmatic in their approach to conquest, didn't simply defeat these tribes and move on. They studied them, they learned from them, and most importantly, they took their secrets. When Roman forces encountered Gallic warriors charging into battle with enormous mastiffs at their sides, tearing through enemy lines with terrifying efficiency, the Romans recognized genius when they saw it. This wasn't barbarism. This was military innovation at its finest. But Rome didn't just adopt the war dog concept. They perfected it. They systematized it. They turned it into a science. Where tribal peoples might train a handful of dogs for battle, Rome created industrial-scale breeding programs. Where others relied on natural aggression and basic commands, Romans developed comprehensive training regimens that would make modern military programs look primitive by comparison. The transformation began around the 2nd century before the Common Era, when Roman military engineers started studying canine behavior with the same methodical approach they applied to siege warfare and road construction. They established breeding facilities across the empire, carefully selecting bloodlines for specific traits: size, aggression, intelligence, trainability, endurance, and most crucially, the ability to distinguish between friend and foe in the chaos of battle. These weren't random experiments. Roman military theorists understood that warfare was evolving. Enemies were becoming more sophisticated, battles more complex, and traditional tactics sometimes insufficient. They needed weapons that could adapt, that could think, that could operate independently while remaining absolutely loyal to Roman command. War dogs represented the perfect fusion of natural predatory instinct and disciplined military training. The selection process for potential war dogs was ruthless and scientific. Roman handlers would observe entire litters from birth, noting which puppies showed the right combination of fearlessness, aggression, and intelligence. They looked for animals that didn't back down from confrontation, that showed natural pack leadership qualities, and most importantly, that demonstrated the capacity for focused, controlled violence rather than wild, undirected rage. Only a small percentage of dogs made it through the initial screening. Those that did entered a training program that lasted years and pushed both animal and handler to their absolute limits. The Romans understood that creating an effective war dog wasn't just about teaching an animal to attack. It was about forging a living weapon that could operate in the most chaotic, terrifying environments while maintaining discipline and responding to complex commands. The training facilities themselves were marvels of military engineering. Located in secure compounds throughout the empire, these installations featured elaborate obstacle courses, mock battlefields, and specialized equipment designed to simulate every possible combat scenario. Dogs learned to navigate siege ladders, charge across broken terrain, and most remarkably, distinguish between different types of armor and clothing to identify specific targets. But the physical training was only part of the equation. Roman war dogs underwent psychological conditioning that bordered on the extraordinary. Handlers used techniques that wouldn't be out of place in modern behavioral psychology, carefully shaping each animal's responses through a combination of rewards, punishments, and environmental manipulation. The goal was to create dogs that could switch instantly between docile companions and lethal predators based on specific signals. The bonding process between handler and dog was perhaps the most critical element of the entire program. Unlike modern military working dogs that might serve with multiple handlers, Roman war dogs were paired with a single soldier for life. This created an almost supernatural level of communication and trust between man and animal. The handler could direct his dog with subtle gestures, whistle commands, or even facial expressions that would be invisible to enemies but crystal clear to the trained animal. This partnership extended far beyond the battlefield. Handler and dog lived together, ate together, and trained together for years before seeing combat. The Roman military recognized that the effectiveness of their war dogs depended entirely on this bond. A dog that trusted its handler completely would follow orders that seemed to defy natural instinct, charging into situations that would terrify most animals. The varieties of war dogs employed by Rome were as diverse as the empire itself. Different breeds served different tactical purposes, each carefully selected and trained for specific battlefield roles. The massive mastiffs, descendants of ancient Molosser breeds, served as shock troops, capable of bringing down cavalry horses or breaking infantry formations. Smaller, more agile breeds worked as scouts and messengers, able to navigate enemy territory undetected and deliver critical intelligence. Some of the most feared Roman war dogs were the result of careful crossbreeding programs that combined the best traits of multiple bloodlines. These hybrid animals possessed the size and power of mastiffs with the speed and intelligence of smaller hunting breeds. Roman military records describe dogs that stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, weighed over 200 pounds, and could run down fleeing enemies with the persistence of wolves. The feeding and care of these animals represented a significant investment for the Roman military. War dogs received better nutrition than many human soldiers, with carefully planned diets designed to maximize their strength, endurance, and aggression. They were fed raw meat, supplemented with grain and vegetables, and given access to clean water and comfortable shelter. This wasn't luxury. It was strategic necessity. A malnourished war dog was a liability, not an asset. Medical care for war dogs was surprisingly advanced, with specialized veterinarians who understood both animal physiology and battlefield medicine. These practitioners developed techniques for treating combat injuries, preventing disease, and maintaining the animal's peak physical condition. They even created protective equipment for dogs, including leather armor and spiked collars that turned each animal into a walking fortress. The deployment of Roman war dogs in actual combat was a spectacle that defied imagination and redefined the very nature of warfare. When legions prepared for battle, the sound that preceded the clash of steel wasn't just the marching of boots or the rattle of armor. It was something far more primal and terrifying. The deep, resonant growls of hundreds of war dogs, held in check by their handlers until the perfect moment to unleash hell upon their enemies. Roman military tacticians developed specific formations and strategies built entirely around their canine warriors. The most devastating of these was known as the canis wedge, a formation where war dogs would charge ahead of the main infantry line, creating chaos and terror in enemy ranks before the legionaries even engaged. These animals moved with supernatural coordination, as if they shared a single mind, flowing around obstacles and converging on targets with deadly precision. The psychological impact of these attacks cannot be overstated. Imagine standing in a shield wall, knowing that your training and equipment could protect you from swords and spears, only to see a wave of massive, snarling beasts charging directly at you. These weren't wild animals acting on instinct. These were trained killers following complex battle plans, and that distinction made them infinitely more terrifying. Roman war dogs were taught to target specific vulnerabilities in enemy formations and individual soldiers. They knew to go for the gaps in armor, to drag down mounted opponents, and to create openings that infantry could exploit. Some dogs were trained to grab shields and wrench them away from defenders, leaving them exposed to following troops. Others learned to hamstring cavalry horses, bringing riders crashing to the ground where they could be finished by human soldiers. The training regimens for these combat techniques were brutally realistic. Dogs practiced on specially constructed dummies, wearing authentic enemy armor, learning exactly where to bite and how much pressure to apply. They trained against live opponents using protective gear, developing the timing and precision needed to disable without immediately killing, allowing Roman soldiers to finish the job or take prisoners as needed. Perhaps most remarkably, Roman war dogs could operate independently for extended periods while still following their original orders. Handlers could release their animals at the beginning of a battle and trust them to continue fighting effectively, even if separated by chaos and distance. The dogs had been conditioned to recognize Roman uniforms, equipment, and even the specific scents of their own legion, ensuring they never attacked friendly forces, even in the confusion of combat. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of these animals were equally impressive. Roman war dogs could be sent ahead of advancing armies to scout enemy positions, returning with information about troop movements, fortifications, and supply lines. They were trained to recognize different types of military equipment and could even distinguish between regular soldiers and officers based on subtle differences in armor and dress. Night operations represented another area where war dogs provided Rome with an overwhelming advantage. While human soldiers struggled to see and coordinate in darkness, the enhanced senses of their canine companions turned night battles into hunting expeditions. Dogs could track enemy movements by scent, hear whispered commands from hundreds of yards away, and navigate terrain that would slow or stop conventional forces. The breeding programs that supported these military operations were vast and sophisticated, spanning the entire empire. Roman administrators maintained detailed records of bloodlines, tracking which combinations produced the most effective warriors. They imported breeding stock from conquered territories, always seeking to improve their animals through careful genetic selection. Some facilities specialized in producing dogs for specific environments, whether desert warfare in North Africa or forest combat in Germania. The economic value of a fully trained Roman war dog was astronomical. Military records suggest that a single veteran war dog could be worth as much as 50 regular soldiers in terms of combat effectiveness. This wasn't mere accounting. It reflected the reality that these animals could accomplish things that human warriors simply could not, whether breaking cavalry charges, pursuing fleeing enemies, or operating behind enemy lines. Training never truly ended for these remarkable animals. Even veteran war dogs continued to practice and learn new techniques throughout their careers. Roman military doctrine recognized that warfare was constantly evolving, and their canine warriors needed to adapt accordingly. Dogs that had served in multiple campaigns became teachers themselves, their experienced handlers using them to train the next generation of war dogs and human soldiers alike. The care and maintenance of war dogs during active campaigns required specialized logistics that most armies couldn't even imagine. Roman supply trains included dedicated wagons for dog food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Field veterinarians traveled with every major expedition, ready to treat injuries and maintain the health of these valuable assets. Even the camps were designed with special areas for the dogs, complete with shelters and exercise areas. The retirement of war dogs was handled with the same systematic approach that characterized every aspect of Roman military organization. Veterans that could no longer serve in active combat were often retained as breeding stock or training assistants. Some were gifted to retiring handlers, allowing the lifelong partnerships to continue in civilian life. The Romans understood that these animals had given everything in service to the empire and deserved to live out their remaining years in comfort and dignity. The legacy of Roman war dogs extended far beyond their immediate military applications. The training techniques and breeding programs developed by Roman handlers influenced military animal programs for centuries to come. Medieval knights adopted modified versions of Roman dog training methods. Renaissance military theorists studied ancient Roman texts on war dogs when developing their own animal combat units. Even today, modern military working dog programs owe a debt to the innovations pioneered by Roman handlers 2,000 years ago. The emphasis on bonding between handler and animal, the systematic approach to training, and the recognition that dogs could serve roles far beyond simple attack animals all trace their origins back to the Roman legions and their four-legged warriors. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Roman war dogs was the way they fundamentally changed how military leaders thought about warfare itself. They demonstrated that victory didn't always belong to the side with the most soldiers or the best equipment. Sometimes it belonged to the commanders who were creative enough to find entirely new approaches to the ancient art of combat. The fear that Roman war dogs instilled in their enemies went far beyond rational military calculation. It tapped into something primal, something that reached back to humanity's earliest nightmares about being hunted by predators in the darkness. When word spread that Roman legions were approaching with their canine auxiliaries, entire armies would sometimes abandon their positions before the first battle cry was even heard. This wasn't cowardice. It was a survival instinct that recognized these animals represented a form of warfare that transcended conventional combat. Enemy commanders discovered that their usual tactical preparations meant nothing against an opponent that could think, adapt, and coordinate attacks in ways no human soldier ever could. Traditional defensive formations designed to stop infantry charges crumbled when faced with animals that could slip between shields, leap over barriers, and attack from angles that military engineers had never considered. The psychological warfare aspect was so effective that some Roman generals would deliberately leak information about their war dogs to enemy spies, knowing that fear would do half their work before the battle even began. The intelligence networks of opposing armies struggled to develop effective countermeasures against these four-legged warriors. How do you prepare soldiers to fight an enemy that attacks with the ferocity of a wild beast, but the discipline of a trained legionary? How do you maintain morale when your troops know they might face creatures that could track them by scent, hear their whispered plans, and strike without warning in the dead of night? Some enemy forces attempted to use their own dogs as a defensive measure, but these hastily trained animals were no match for the sophisticated war machines that Rome had spent decades perfecting. The difference between a guard dog and a Roman war dog was like comparing a village militia to the Praetorian Guard. One was a simple deterrent. The other was a weapon of mass destruction wrapped in fur and fangs. The most disturbing accounts come from battlefield survivors who described the almost supernatural coordination between Roman war dogs and their human handlers. These partnerships had evolved beyond mere training into something that resembled telepathic communication. A handler could direct multiple dogs simultaneously, orchestrating complex maneuvers that would confuse and overwhelm enemy forces. Dogs would split up to attack from different directions, regroup on silent signals, and execute flanking movements that would have challenged experienced cavalry units. Roman military archives contain detailed accounts of specific battles where war dogs turned certain defeat into overwhelming victory. During the conquest of Britannia, Celtic warriors who had successfully held off Roman infantry for hours were routed in minutes when war dogs were released into their hill fort. The animals scaled walls that human soldiers couldn't climb, opened gates from the inside, and created such chaos that organized resistance simply collapsed. In Germania, entire tribal confederations that had united against Roman expansion found their alliance shattered by psychological warfare campaigns centered around war dogs. Roman commanders would send small units with their canine companions to harass enemy camps at night, never engaging in direct combat but creating an atmosphere of constant threat. Warriors who could face death in battle with courage found themselves unable to sleep, unable to relax, unable to function as an effective fighting force when they knew predators were watching them from the darkness. The training for these night operations was particularly intensive and disturbing. Dogs learned to move in complete silence, to approach targets without triggering any of the normal warning signs that might alert sentries. They practiced attacking sleeping opponents, understanding exactly how much force was needed to disable without creating noise that might wake nearby enemies. Some were trained to drag unconscious victims away from camps, allowing Roman forces to gather intelligence through interrogation, while enemy commanders wondered where their missing soldiers had gone. The breeding programs reached their peak during the height of the empire, when Roman genetic selection had produced dogs that were almost unrecognizable compared to their original ancestors. These animals possessed intelligence that bordered on the uncanny, able to understand complex tactical situations and make independent decisions that would save their own lives while accomplishing their missions. They could differentiate between civilians and combatants, between officers and enlisted men, between allies and enemies wearing similar equipment. The most elite war dogs underwent training that seems almost impossible to believe. They learned to recognize different languages, responding only to commands given in Latin while ignoring orders shouted in Germanic or Celtic tongues. They could identify specific individuals by scent alone, tracking particular targets across vast distances and through crowds of people. Some were trained to retrieve specific items from enemy camps, whether documents, weapons, or even captured Roman standards. Medical knowledge about these animals reached levels that wouldn't be seen again for over 1,000 years. Roman veterinarians understood canine psychology, nutrition, and physiology with remarkable precision. They developed surgical techniques for treating battle wounds, medications for preventing disease, and training methods for rehabilitation after injury. War dogs that lost limbs in combat were fitted with prosthetic devices that allowed them to continue serving in modified roles. The economic impact of the war dog program extended throughout the entire Roman economy. Specialized craftsmen produced leather armor, metal collars, and training equipment exclusively for military canines. Entire industries developed around providing food, medicine, and transportation for these animals. Small fortunes were made by merchants who could supply the exotic meats and rare minerals that kept war dogs at peak performance. The social status of war dog handlers rivaled that of cavalry officers or siege engineers. These men were recognized as elite specialists whose skills were irreplaceable and whose knowledge was closely guarded. They formed their own military brotherhood with secret techniques passed down through generations of handlers. Young soldiers competed fiercely for the opportunity to join their ranks, knowing that success would guarantee them honor, respect, and financial security for life. The retirement ceremonies for war dogs that had served with distinction were elaborate affairs that honored both animal and handler. These events reinforced the Roman belief that loyalty and service deserved recognition regardless of species. Veteran war dogs were celebrated as heroes of the empire, their achievements recorded in military histories alongside those of human commanders. Some of the most famous received monuments and burial sites that were maintained for centuries after their deaths. The influence of Roman war dog tactics spread throughout the ancient world as other civilizations attempted to copy their success. Persian armies tried to develop their own canine units. Egyptian forces experimented with training programs based on captured Roman manuals. Germanic tribes that had fought against Roman war dogs began breeding programs designed to create their own versions of these fearsome warriors. But none of these attempts achieved the systematic perfection that Rome had developed over centuries of refinement. The Roman approach wasn't just about training animals to fight. It was about creating a complete military doctrine that integrated canine capabilities into every aspect of warfare, from reconnaissance to assault to pursuit. This holistic approach gave Roman commanders options that their enemies couldn't match and advantages that couldn't be overcome through conventional means. The decline of Roman war dogs began not with military defeat, but with changing political priorities and evolving combat technologies. As the empire shifted from expansion to defense, the massive breeding programs became increasingly expensive to maintain. New military challenges required different solutions, and resources that had once supported war dog training were redirected toward fortifications and professional armies. The barbarian invasions that eventually overwhelmed the Western Empire were aided by the fact that Roman war dog units had been drastically reduced by that time. Many of the Germanic tribes that attacked Rome remembered the terror these animals had once inspired and specifically targeted the remaining war dog facilities to prevent their use in defensive operations. The loss of this military advantage contributed to Rome's inability to maintain control over its vast territories. Yet even as the Western Empire crumbled, the knowledge and techniques developed by Roman war dog handlers didn't disappear entirely. Byzantine forces continued using modified versions of Roman training methods. Medieval European armies incorporated elements of Roman canine warfare into their own military doctrines. The influence of these ancient innovations can be traced through military history right up to modern times. The archaeological evidence for Roman war dogs continues to emerge from excavation sites across the former empire. Burial grounds reveal the remains of massive dogs interred with military honors alongside their human handlers. Weapons and armor designed specifically for canine warriors demonstrate the sophistication of Roman military engineering. Training facilities with elaborate obstacle courses show the complexity of the programs that created these remarkable animals. Modern military analysts who study ancient Roman tactics are consistently amazed by the advanced psychological and tactical principles that governed war dog operations. The Romans understood concepts about animal behavior, human psychology, and battlefield dynamics that wouldn't be formally recognized by military science for another 1,500 years. Their systematic approach to developing and deploying these living weapons represents one of the most innovative military programs in human history. The technological sophistication of Roman war dog programs extended into areas that seem almost science fiction when viewed through the lens of ancient military capabilities. Roman handlers developed communication systems that allowed them to coordinate multiple dog units across vast battlefields using nothing more than horn calls, flag signals, and scent markers. These animals could interpret complex tactical instructions and execute coordinated maneuvers that would challenge modern military units equipped with radio communications. The scent marking system alone represented a breakthrough in ancient military intelligence. Roman forces would establish scent trails using specially prepared compounds that only their war dogs could detect and follow. These invisible highways allowed canine units to navigate through enemy territory, locate specific targets, and rendezvous with friendly forces even in complete darkness or unfamiliar terrain. Enemy commanders never understood how Roman dogs seemed to possess supernatural navigation abilities. Training facilities developed techniques for conditioning war dogs to operate in every conceivable environment and weather condition. Dogs learned to fight effectively in desert heat, mountain snow, swamp mud, and forest undergrowth. They practiced combat maneuvers in simulated siege conditions, learning to scale walls, navigate siege towers, and operate inside confined spaces where conventional troops would be helpless. Some specialized units were trained exclusively for naval operations, able to board enemy ships and fight effectively on rolling decks. The psychological conditioning of these animals reached depths that modern behaviorists would find both fascinating and disturbing. Roman handlers understood that creating an effective war dog required more than teaching aggressive behaviors. They needed to forge animals that could maintain absolute discipline under the most chaotic conditions while retaining the ability to think independently and adapt to unexpected situations. This balance between controlled aggression and tactical intelligence represented the pinnacle of ancient animal training. Combat records describe war dogs that could distinguish between different types of enemy weapons and adjust their attack strategies accordingly. Dogs facing spear-armed opponents used different techniques than those engaging sword-wielding enemies. They learned to recognize and exploit the weaknesses of various armor types, understanding exactly where to apply pressure to disable heavily protected opponents. This tactical awareness went far beyond simple attack training into the realm of battlefield analysis. The breeding programs produced animals with physical capabilities that bordered on the impossible. Some war dogs could leap over 8-foot walls, drag down mounted cavalry, and maintain pursuit speeds that exhausted human runners over distances of several miles. Roman genetic selection had created creatures that combined the size and power of bears with the speed and agility of wolves. These physical adaptations were matched by mental capabilities that allowed complex problem-solving and independent decision-making. Intelligence operations utilizing war dogs represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the entire program. These animals could be sent deep into enemy territory to gather specific information, returning with intelligence that would guide entire campaign strategies. They learned to recognize different types of military equipment, count enemy soldiers, and even identify specific individuals based on detailed scent profiles provided by their handlers. Some war dogs were trained for assassination missions that seem impossible for animals to accomplish. They could infiltrate enemy camps, locate specific targets, and eliminate them without alerting guards or leaving obvious traces. These operations required animals that could think several steps ahead, understanding complex cause and effect relationships and planning their actions accordingly. The level of cognitive ability required suggests that Roman breeding programs had produced dogs with intelligence that approached human levels in specific areas. The medical knowledge applied to war dog care included surgical procedures that wouldn't be seen in human medicine for centuries. Roman veterinarians could perform operations on wounded animals that saved their lives and returned them to active duty. They developed prosthetic devices for dogs that had lost limbs in combat, allowing continued service in modified roles. Pain management techniques using various herbs and compounds kept injured animals comfortable during recovery periods. Armor and equipment designed for war dogs represented masterpieces of ancient engineering. Leather harnesses were reinforced with metal plates that protected vital organs while allowing full range of motion. Spiked collars served both defensive and offensive purposes, protecting the neck while turning each dog into a living mace. Some elite units were equipped with specially designed weapons that attached to the animals, effectively turning them into four-legged siege engines. The logistics required to support war dog operations during extended campaigns were staggering. Supply trains included specialized wagons for transporting dog food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Field kitchens prepared specific diets for canine warriors, understanding that proper nutrition was essential for maintaining peak performance. Water supplies were carefully managed to ensure that war dogs remained hydrated and healthy even during desert operations. Communication between handlers and their animals evolved into something that resembled a complete language. Experienced partnerships could exchange complex information using combinations of vocal commands, hand signals, and subtle body language. Some handlers claimed they could conduct entire tactical briefings with their dogs, explaining mission objectives and contingency plans in ways the animals clearly understood and could execute independently. The retirement and pension systems for war dogs were as comprehensive as those provided to human veterans. Animals that had served with distinction received lifetime care, including specialized medical treatment, comfortable housing, and high-quality food. Some veteran war dogs were retained as breeding stock, ensuring that their superior genetics would continue in future generations. Others served as training assistants, their experience invaluable for developing new canine warriors. The cultural impact of war dogs extended far beyond their military applications. Roman literature, art, and sculpture frequently depicted these animals as symbols of imperial power and military excellence. Children throughout the empire grew up hearing stories of legendary war dogs and their heroic deeds. The animals became cultural icons that represented Roman values of loyalty, courage, and disciplined aggression. Enemy propaganda often focused on demonizing Roman war dogs, portraying them as unnatural monsters rather than trained animals. This psychological warfare backfired by reinforcing the terror these creatures inspired. Stories of their capabilities grew with each retelling, creating myths that made them seem even more fearsome than they actually were. Some enemy tribes developed entire religious beliefs around the supernatural powers attributed to Roman war dogs. The story of Roman war dogs reveals one of history's most chilling military innovations, a weapon that combined primal terror with systematic precision. These weren't just animals trained to fight. They were living instruments of psychological warfare that could break enemy morale before the first sword was drawn. The Romans understood something fundamental about human nature, that our deepest fears reach back to ancient memories of being hunted by predators in the darkness. By weaponizing this primal terror and combining it with their legendary discipline and organization, they created a military advantage that no enemy could truly counter. The legacy of these four-legged warriors reminds us that true military genius often lies not in following conventional wisdom, but in finding entirely new ways to achieve victory. Rome's war dogs disappeared with the empire that created them, but their shadow still haunts the pages of history as a testament to the terrifying effectiveness of innovation guided by ruthless pragmatism.